If you've ever walked through a woodland and wondered how so many different bird species can exist in one place, it all comes down to niche. Niche is the role of an organism in its ecosystem. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to describe the importance of niche in terms of that coexistence, how many different species can exist in one place. We're then going to describe the competitive exclusion principle, and then finish up by looking at how organisms can be generalists or specialists, and look at some of the examples and the problems that arise from this particular concept. So if a niche is an organism's role within an ecosystem, let's have a look at an example. Now, this particular image here shows 5 different warbler species that live within a boreal forest. What you can see in this particular image is their foraging height. So this is where they feed. So the myrtle warbler feeds from down around the ground up to around 30 feet up into that particular forest. On the other hand, if you take the Cape May warbler, it tends to feed from around 40 to 50 feet in the air. It's got quite a small foraging area. But what's really important here is that these 2 particular warblers don't overlap. They don't come into contact with each other, they don't compete for resource. So what we can understand then is a range of warbler species can occupy the same habitat as they've adapted feeding behavior at different heights within a forest. And this can relate to, deciduous forest, it can relate to the savanna, it can relate to tundra. It's really important that we understand, especially feeding behavior is important when it comes to niche. Now, Darwin realized this when he visited the Galapagos Islands. He collected a range of different specimens of finches. And what he realized is that they had a similar kind of structure. And he hypothesized that they had a single ancestral species that colonized the islands millions of years ago. Since then, around 13 species have popped up into existence on the Galapagos Islands. There are 14 in the image because the Cocos finch isn't endemic on the Galapagos Islands, but it's included to show different finches. What he realised is that there were slight modifications to the structure of the beaks, and this kind of influenced what the birds were able to eat. So you can see things like the large ground finch has this large crushing beak and it's able to eat seeds, but it wouldn't be able to necessarily catch insects. If you look at the insect-eating birds, they have quite small, thin beaks. So especially the warbler finch, as an example, it's able to get into small nooks and crannies and pull kind of bugs and worms out of pieces of dead wood, etc. Now, if we were to look at these particular birds and we can relate this across any type of animal, we have 3 different feeding habits explored in the last lesson: herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Now, depending on the feeding behavior of an organism, this alters their position in an ecosystem. Now, plants don't necessarily relate to this because plants tend to be producers. They're at the first level. Animals, on the other hand, can be different positions in that trophic level. Now, herbivores are always primary consumers. They always eat plants. So, for example, your ground finch that eats seeds, they are on the second level of an ecosystem, and they feed on the plant products. Carnivores, on the other hand, they occupy higher trophic levels. They're relying on something that feeds on a plant to get their food. So, for example, the warbler finch, or the insectivorous finches as well, they eat insects, and they are feeding at the 3rd or maybe even the 4th level of an ecosystem. Omnivores may occupy a number of different trophic levels. For example, if they are eating plant material, they're feeding at the 2nd level, and if they're eating animals, then they're eating at the 3rd or the 4th level. And this is really important, so they can change their trophic level depending on what they tend to eat. Now, in this image, we can see a wide range of different beak structures in the bird kingdom. For example, you can see things like the probing bill that's able to dig down into mud and pull kind of crustaceans out of mud. You have ones like the nectar-feeding bird in the top right-hand corner, maybe like a hummingbird, and they're able to get into into plants and access nectar. You also then have the raptors. Raptors are able to eat meat and rip it off the flesh and the bone, and these are important apex predators. Now, each bird in the image has a different feeding behavior, and each plays a different role in its ecosystem. So a lot of them will be, for example, eating. Some of them may be eating producers, so the grain eating, for example. Some will be predators. There's also a group there in the bottom middle, vultures, scavengers, and these play a really important role in the cleanup of ecosystems. So if you think about the fact that they feed on carcasses that have been left by lions, for example, they're really important in cleaning up those carcasses to prevent the spread of disease and other problems that might arise from that in an ecosystem. So what we need to think about then is why do niches exist? And coexistence is key to this. Two species competing for the same resource can never coexist. And this is an important ecological principle in the sense that this is the competitive exclusion principle. So if two species compete for the same thing, one of them is going to lose out and one of them is going to win. And we can demonstrate this in a lab setting, which we're going to do now. We're going to grow some Paramecium bacteria. Paramecium grown separately in two separate test tubes. The test tube becomes the habitat, and within the test tube will be food. There'll be some kind of nutrient, essentially. Now, if they're grown separately, both populations will thrive. There's no competition. This is completely unrealistic to the world around us because populations do intermingle. So what we do in the next stage is we introduce the two bacterium populations together, and this is what happens. When they're grown together, one of two things are likely to happen. The first is on the left. One species dies out, and this is called exclusion. So in this case, the blue population has thrived and outcompeted the pink population. On the right-hand side, we see a different scenario, and this is where the species alter their resource use. So in this particular case, the pink population has moved to the top. There's their top floating, and the blue has become a bottom floating population, and they're feeding on different substances within that particular test tube habitat. And this is where a niche is formed. So neither overlap. And this is really important in terms of understanding how coexistence can occur. Competition is really important in ecology, and it can occur in one of two ways. What we understand is that one of these particular types of competition, intraspecific competition, occurs between individuals of the same species. So, for example, a lion and a lion. So two lions might go after the same antelope. One of them is going to win and one of them is going to lose. And this happens all the time. It's not something that can necessarily be avoided. And it doesn't tend to affect the population or the species as a whole. There's going to be intraspecific competition all of the time. Now, it's the other type of competition that's the problem. Interspecific competition. This is where it occurs between individuals of different species. So, for example, a lion and a cheetah. Now, this might occasionally happen if a lion or a cheetah maybe go in really extreme conditions where there's not a lot of food. They may start to compete for the same kind of pool of antelope, as an example. But generally speaking, the lions are going to win. They're bigger. They hunt in larger prides, essentially. And the cheetah are probably going to lose out in this particular case, and they may have to feed on scraps. Now, when they feed on the scraps, they're generally then changing their behavior. They're not then feeding in their natural way. If they don't do that, then they'll die out. So what we understand is that interspecific competition, it does occur occasionally in extreme conditions, but it's generally something that we want to avoid in an ecological sense. Now, it has happened when we get invasive species. So this is non-native species being introduced into habitats and ecosystems. This can cause some real issues. For example, the Asian hornet comes from Asia and is moving towards Europe. It's moving into Europe and it predates on bees, and it doesn't have any natural predators. So its population is unchecked and it's feeding on important pollinators in our own ecosystems. Japanese knotweed at the top right. This is a fast-growing weed that was actually deliberately introduced in the Victorian era because it's quite pretty. Problem is, it outcompetes other species and it can cause structural damage to things like concrete and tarmac. And it's very difficult to get rid of. The bullfrog in the bottom left, quite a famous invasive species. This outcompetes other native species. It also, as you can see in the image, predates on these species occasionally. So it's quite omnivorous in terms of its behavior. and it will eat pretty much anything. And it also has a lack of predators, so it goes unchecked. The last example is the lionfish, and this has been introduced into the Mediterranean Sea. Ecologists aren't sure if it's to do with climate change or if it's because it's been released into the wild by people who don't want to keep them in their own aquariums anymore. But these are causing serious damage to natural seagrass beds. They feed on them, and they're a bit like the bullfrog. They eat a lot, and they're not particularly fussy about what they eat, and they're causing a lot of damage to ecosystems around the Mediterranean Sea. Now, generally speaking, these invasive species are quite good at being put into a new environment because they're quite generalist. And what we mean by generalist is they're not too fussy about what they eat. They tend to be quite omnivorous. They tend to be quite fast reproducing. Two examples here, we've got the raccoon and the rat. And these are two examples of generalist species that are quite good at adapting to new conditions. They're generally quite good at living in human environments as well, in cities, and they can be quite seen as pests essentially. So it's quite worth including that in your kind of ideas. Compare it to these guys at the bottom, the panda and the koala. These are very specialist in terms of the way they behave and the way they feed. They tend to just feed on one species of plant. So the panda eats bamboo and the koala eats eucalyptus. They are also very prone to invasion or problems with disease if the disease hits the particular plant species that they feed on. So if there was no bamboo, which is unlikely, but it's possible bamboo could take a hit, then the panda would have very little to eat and it would die out as a species. Also bear in mind issues around the fact that pandas don't reproduce particularly quickly. They're quite specialist in that sense. And you have some problems with these specialist species as such. So competition is important in terms of niche and in terms of coexistence. So what we understand at this point is that niche is an organism's role in an ecosystem. Having a niche prevents resource overlap and competition with other species. If species compete, they need to adapt or die. Invasive species put competitive pressure on ecosystems and on native organisms, and it tends to be specialists that lose out in this particular case. And generalists are much more able to adapt to competition and therefore survive any kind of pressures that they get. Now you've watched this, you can watch it back, make notes, etc., and then have a go at the quiz. Good luck.